there are curious things in the Australian higher education sector, which is that 2025 data on public funding for Australian universities is 46.5%. Of the funding of universities is from government, so less than half, and that fluctuates a bit from year to year. Sometimes it's quite a bit less than that, and there are also different ways of measuring it that show it's substantially less, but that's kind of official numbers. So it's an interesting situation, I think, in terms of the government is actually not the majority shareholder in the sector, but acts as though it is, and in fact more extreme than that is kind of in a phase of the pendulum swinging to the more extreme centralized regulation. So there is some interesting tension there, I think, for the broader society to think about as well. What exactly is it that we want from this, and is it working? My aspiration is I want to see the people we are training through universities change the world, because it really is that kind of agenda, I think. And so are we actually, building and fostering this talent? Things that I value in an education institution would be
Please give me a minute of your time. If analytics are to be believed, you're more likely to be a listener than a subscriber. No, this isn't a plea for your money, but it is a plea for your support, which can be free. The good news is you're already doing the hard part by taking the time to listen to conversations that are consequential. This show is still being built episode by episode, guest by guest, and your subscription and feedback helps me to determine who to invite, what to ask, so we can ensure that we deliver the most consequential content to you possible. So please, take a moment to subscribe on your platform of choice. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get on with the show. Australia has spent a decade arguing about universities without ever quite arguing about what they are for. We debate fees, caps, international student numbers, and research funding formulas, and each of these debates smuggles in an answer to the larger question, without ever putting it to a vote. Price an arts degree high enough, and you've made a claim about the worth of the humanities. You've simply made it with a spreadsheet, rather than a philosophical argument. My guest has spent his career inside almost every model this country uses to answer that question. He has worked at the Australian National University, a large public research institution. He has worked at the Australian Institute of Music, a private specialist college. He spent 5 years as head of school for humanities, arts and social sciences at the University of New England, a regional university teaching a disproportionate share of the students the system was never designed for. And he is now president of Nantian Institute, a small independent college grounded in Buddhist values, an institution of a kind this country has almost none of. He has also held senior roles at the Australian Institute of Music and the Australian National University, and is a pianist and composer. His scholarly work on Morton Feldman argued that music, long assumed to be intuitive and free, was in fact built on a deliberate, hidden structure, which is, as it happens, a serviceable description of the Australian University, an institution that speaks the language of autonomy, while its most important variables are set in Canberra. His own recent work, an album released this year called Solarization, consists of place-based investigations in experimental sound. That is worth noting, because the argument he makes about universities is ultimately an argument about place. Who gets to make knowledge, and where? Last year he published an essay arguing that when public figures claim the humanities do not lead to careers, they are not mistaken. They are lying, and they know it. The seam I want to work is whether the things we need universities to do can be done under other arrangements entirely, smaller, less regulated, or whether the model we have is the only one that survives contact with reality, and the complaint is therefore not about structure at all, but about money. Professor Alistair Noble, welcome to On the Subject of Leadership.
Good morning, Robert. It's great to meet with you, and thanks for the lovely introduction. I'm really appreciative of how you draw so many threads together from my life and work, and makes me feel you perhaps know me better than I do myself this morning.
Far too kind, far too kind. I always think when talking to people, we are such a rich tapestry. I spend most of my career in corporate life, and I always like to say I'm much more than my role. And I always hope that introductions for guests try to draw on that richness, because I think there are so many wonderful themes to explore.
And on themes, let's maybe dive into one of the first ones and starting to look at the university systems. And you've worked inside such a broad range, which I personally find very, very fascinating. The private specialist college, the regional university, and now a small independent institute. What does that comparison show you that a single vantage point often occludes? And I suppose perhaps unpack that for guests who might have, shall I call it a bit of a monolithic idea of the sandstone university in a major capital city. Maybe you could unpack that for listeners.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think, as you say, in some ways, perhaps my career trajectory of moving back and forth between public and private sectors and urban and regional universities can seem a bit unusual. Probably, certainly, I remember when I first moved from my work from ANU into the private sector. Many of my colleagues and friends thought this was an unusual and strange thing to do. I think since that time, more and more people are doing this, to be fair. So I guess that's one thing I would just flag is I think people being, I hope, less afraid of that. Moving from one type of institution to another is something that's growing and developing, which is useful. The reason I think it's useful is, as you've indicated a bit in your question, is around how it gives you that a little bit, perhaps a broader perspective on what higher education can be than if you stay on the career path in a single type of institution, or even actually a single institution, as in the past many academics have done. So I think that moving around is really valuable in just showing different ways of working, different ways of solving problems. I would say too, I think, the different types of universities that I've worked in and private institutions, each have different strengths, I think, and advantages and different vulnerabilities. So again, I think having something I guess I appreciate is having had this perspective of seeing it from different angles. The classic, I guess, being that the older G08 established public universities, of course, have a great advantage in terms of their research capability, and that flows through into things like international rankings and so on. On the other hand, I guess as a useful comparison, I think if we look at some other kinds of metrics like the National Student Experience Surveys, then we can see that actually one could make an argument based on that sort of data that maybe some of the best teaching in this country is happening in the private sector. And so I think, as I say, there are different areas of strength. The key point I'd like to make, I think, though, is that if we can start to, I guess, respect those the capabilities of different kinds of institutions and what they can contribute, there's things we can all learn from each other. And I guess in particular, I guess that sense of what I've learned a lot from my career is that sense of the value of the private sector and the quality of work that happens now, I think, in the private sector in terms of teaching, course design, and the approach to learning. That's really, I think, pushing against perhaps the older narrative of private sector higher education in Australia as somehow a second-class kind of an entity. I think we are coming to a time where that doesn't hold up anymore, and it's a good thing that we can start to recognize the amazing people in the private sector, for example, doing amazing work that I think in the past has a bit fallen under the radar. The similar angle I think we could take with the sort of urban regional, that again I think we have such amazing work happening in regional Australian universities, and I would like to see that, and I think we would all like to see that on a more equal footing, with the big city universities over time.
I do think that that is very interesting when looking, particularly I think at the international rankings. I think picking up on a thread that you noted there around the research work and very large institutions, obviously given the volume of academics, you get more papers. More papers means higher chance of publication in the top tier journals, which leads to, and there is that that sense of value and prestige being tightly linked. Certainly my own experience of academia is to try and avoid equating value with money, but I think there is also still that sitting at the background. I was listening to another podcast actually the other day, the Prof G podcast from the US, and the host was sort of looking at the MBA program, and one of the listeners had dialed in and said, look, the host is actually a professor at university, and he sort of said, do you think there's any value to the MBA program? And if I can highly distill his argument, the answer was, it's a very expensive thing to do. In the US, MBAs, I think, range anything from about 85,000 to about 290,000. And his answer was, well, if you can get into a top-tier institution, like, say, Kellogg, or Harvard or something, and you network very well, then it does repay the investment, if not more questionable. And what it seemed to suggest is that, yes, there is a bit of an assumption. If I go to a Harvard, I'm getting a top education, but it really seemed to be more about the branding of the education and how widely that's respected in shall I say, the non-academic community, particularly in a corporate function. Does a CEO or a head of department hiring somebody recognize a university brand? If so, small tick in the box to bring you on board. And I'm wondering if that is perhaps one of the key battles of some of the more private sector institutions, because they often can't quite garner the international ranking tables due to lack of volume in research. Do you think that perhaps often turns people away from the model, sees them over-index on the big public research institutions?
Certainly it does, yeah. And I mean, we see this most clearly with following the movement of international students around the world, where, very much, as you say, they are investing a great deal in an education that they need to build their career or to establish their career. And so they're going to be looking for, understandably, as you say, I think that branding and prestige for the sense of buying the best quality degree they can afford, I guess, as we all would,
yeah.
as we all have done. I think the interesting point that in what you're suggesting there, which I would agree with, is that the prestigious branding does not necessarily equate to the best education. So that's a broader kind of question, isn't it? Then more about social attitudes than education. Even as you say, it's that somebody, a hiring manager is going to recognize this institution and preference that person over somebody else, but doesn't necessarily mean they have had a better training or better education, I think.
I think that's so true. I've got a couple of friends who are in Big Four consulting, and some of them feel that their careers are being held back because they didn't go to the right school, be that high school or university, and they really see that very much as a brand or as a prestige element. And I think in certain industries I do see that. I mean, some industries, I won't say that value isn't created, because I think a lot of value is created, but they do very much drive on their own brand. I mean, are you, for example, a McKinsey? Are you a KPMG? That is very much about the brand that is associated with the thinking. So I think for people that are in industries where brand is all dominant, then I can certainly see that. But I do agree, it can often come to not valuing the next level down, which is, okay, I'm going to an extraordinary institution, or at least one that has an extraordinary reputation, but what lecturers do I get? Where is the lecturer at in their life cycle? What is their experience? Are they very young, very keen, but perhaps a little inexperienced, or maybe a bit older, more experienced? Maybe they've become a little bit tired and jaded with their teaching. Yet when you get that wonderful student-teacher interaction, that's when I think really, really great education happens, irrespective of the motto or the university charter.
Yeah, and we would hope, that over time, the people who've had that great education, they may not have that initial advantage in starting their career as somebody from the prestigious school, but they'll be able to do really good work, and one hopes that then that will they'll succeed in the longer term. I think, despite that sort of which school did you go to kind of thing. I hope we can subvert that. I was just going to pick up another angle on this, which is, I think, part of the, a little bit the more sinister side, in a way, at a broader political level of that, sense of the prestige of one school over another, or a certain university over another type of university, is that, of course, we can see very clearly in the Australian context that this 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 is very much linked to our colonial history. And so we see in Australian universities that you're hiring a senior academic, and if they've got a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, they're going to trump everybody from an Australian university. And we just see this happen over and over again. That this kind of like we have this kind of colonial instinct of the reverence for the English universities, and as great as they are, and I think that then we've got kind of then grafted onto that over the years, the some alignment with the American system. And so, as you say, there's again that similar kind of, but I don't know, it strikes me as a similar kind of colonial deference to the Harvard and Stanford and the Ivy Leagues and so on. And I think and yet how seriously do we take the great Japanese universities? NTU in Taipei, these are amazing institutions turning out world-class scholars and scholarship, and yet we don't we don't treat them as in the same way. You know what I mean? let alone within our own Australian context. Yeah.
I think that you're so right on that. And in fact, when I look at even the founding of Australian universities, I mean, from memory, but please check the facts, listeners, Sydney University, I think, is our oldest institution. And if you look at their motto, in Latin it translates as "the mind remains the same, although the star has changed." And its whole principle behind it was coming from the Oxford, Cambridge, the Oxbridge sort of background. Sydney University, it's sandstone, and we're saying, look, the mind is the same, even though we're in a different hemisphere. But again, it's still very much tying itself back to Mother England, that notion of the mother or the paternal institution, and that idea of that legacy, that history. Go back a century and a bit. Sydney University might have only been standing for 10 or 20 years, but we still can claim back to Oxford. We can still call on half a millennia of thinking and understanding, and that's almost that's the bedrock under which you're now coming to learn from. And certainly I think that's true of societies. We very much sort of accrete and grow and develop, but it does, yes, come to mean that we do remain quite tied to that colonial notion. And I think I guess special pleading on my part. I spent most of my academic time at Macquarie University, in many respects a new kid on the block. And so I do end up with almost that inverse snobbery. When I meet someone who says, "Oh, I went to Sydney University," I can only say, "Oh, look, I can only apologise for that. You could have gone to a better institution like Macquarie."
Yeah.
So we do. I think we do always have that, but it is so critical to ensure that we don't underscore the nature, or should I say, undervalue the nature of very different thinking models. And I certainly see that even in terms of the academic structure. I mean, so much of it is incredibly Western-centric, which for some subjects makes a little bit of sense. If you're fascinated by the Mediterranean world of the 1st century BC, it's a Western-situated construct. But if I'm looking at, say, moving into business studies, how am I going to run a modern organization? You need to be able to draw from a broader range of cultures, which I think sort of brings me to one of my other thoughts in terms of the different institutions you've worked with. And I think the things perhaps you most value about universities, which of the models do you find best enliven or enable you in the teaching and also the learning of those values from an institution?
Interesting to think of it in that sort of personal way of what I value, because it might be different to that bigger picture of, as a society, what we think a university is for, as you mentioned in your introduction, which is a different question. So yeah, for me, I think, the things that I value in an education institution would be, a positive work environment where people, students and staff, can flourish and grow. An environment that supports especially that great learning experience for students. I think this is something fundamentally important to me. And where also there's, the sense of the sense of a capacity for scholarly insight that for me is a kind of, a palpable excitement, when it's there, even if it's a latent capacity that's, yet to be, brought into flower or whatever. So those kind of things. Where do I find that in the places I've worked? I mean, the I think it's I think I think it's most evident actually in the smaller private environment, those kind of things. And it's not to say it's not to say, of course, that people in all universities are doing amazing work, but I think in terms of just that, where is it most likely to be best in terms of, as I say, that's just from my personal sort of value system. I think it's that smaller institution, the private rather than public, just has a closer chance of getting it right, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I mean, there is definitely that that risk, I think, of being lost in a system when institutions start to become too big. I think some universities are starting to push in the direction of 100,000 enrolled students. I mean, you've not even a small, you've got almost a very large town, frankly, when you're looking at these institutions. And certainly there's benefit. You've obviously got more, or potentially more opportunity for diversity, but there's also that risk of really becoming the number in the system. And I think if we even think back to the slightly more colonial foundings, I mean, universities, when I sort of think of them in my romantic mind of what it was like for the monks, I sort of think of these small cloistered communities, small groups of perhaps even only as 5 or 10 people coming together to think about problems. And I sort of do feel that some of that gets lost when the institution starts to scale. And I think a staff also get pushed far more on their numbers, and it becomes volumes of papers you're trying to mark, volumes of courses you're trying to teach, and everything becomes KPI driven. And there is a certain point at which volumes very much starts to erode quality, because you simply cannot spend as much time on each individual or student. And therefore I think my heart naturally draws me towards the smaller institutions, which is why I do wonder, how institutions of such scale, can they remain recognizable as a scholarly community, or do they start to degenerate and into, I suppose I would term it, more of a trade school? I'm going there to learn a technical thing, be that plumbing, be that business, be that marketing, or am I actually going there for the idea of scholarly inquiry? And yes, I would very much like a degree at the end of it, because that's useful for my resume, but how does the education, how does what I come away with, particularly considering I think most people tend to only retain something like about 20% of all the things they learn. If I'm only taking away that sliver, what is that sliver that I'm then taking with me into my career and into society more broadly?
Right. And, I think, as I think I tend to argue that I think universities have always been much better at training people for jobs and careers than current sort of political narratives would have us believe. But I think you are right in that the scaling up of universities through this sort of growth fetish we've had as in the sector for so many decades now has maybe created a situation, I think I agree with you, where we lose some things along, or are at risk of losing some things, and I think we can see that happening. And I agree, it probably means we are falling back on what students are in the end getting is the things that can be delivered to a class of 100 or 200 people, rather as you say, as you were describing, that sort of more subtle understanding of a scholarly question, or the more subtle questions we might ask about our genuinely complex world that that aren't going to happen in that kind of factory education environment. The other extreme of this, I think about is, for me with my music background, and other people in creative arts will recognize this as well. So much of my early training and study was one-on-one teaching, with the other extreme, and that has its probably has its own risks and problems as well. But nevertheless, there's that amazing quality of this individual relationship with someone who has high level expert knowledge and ways of communicating that to you, and discussing questions with you in a way that there's just not that time and space to do in a large sort of industrial education model. Yeah. So I think
so true.
The risk is what I think the question is really what we are at risk of losing, rather than necessarily the focus on have we become too vocational, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think actually that's an incredibly compelling argument and a far better framing, because if in a lecture hall of 200-300 students, it's very hard to put a question up on the chalkboard or the whiteboard and say discuss, and then have it more as a seminar style. It obviously becomes far more didactic, and obviously, which I think is very, very popular, far more trending itself to being recorded, to being delivered via video, being delivered remote, which enables an even greater scaling of the student base, but a greater disconnect.
Yeah.
Students that are sitting at home, but fundamentally on TikTok or Facebook or something else going on at the same time, but I'll tune back into the lecture for a minute, then I'm back onto my other thing. And it does certainly create that lack of focus, that lack of engagement. And I think that is the undermining element of it.
Indeed. I think there's alongside the sort of more philosophical aspects of how we might analyze this kind of situation, there are really practical impacts as well in terms of things like as since COVID, of course, a lot of university teaching has progressed towards being more online than it used to be, and the larger classes, and so we have practical problems now, like how do we verify that this is that student's work, because I might have never met that student. I've never actually seen them in a class, or I don't know actually how they think and how they speak, so I can't really tell if that's their work. So there are these very practical aspects. The reason I raise that is it links back into what we were talking about earlier of the perceived quality of the education and the value of the qualification. So if I don't really know who did this work, then we have a problem in maintaining that sense of the quality outcome.
Very, very much agreed. And I think particularly as people draw on the large language models for their work, the large language model is obviously running over a massive data. And in a sense, we're more almost marking our culture than we are necessarily reviewing or engaging with the individual student and the individual student's thinking. And I think that does become so interesting. And I think if we then sort of keep stepping back and thinking about culture more broadly, I think you've sort of said that the notion of regional Australia itself is a bit of a cultural imagination. This idea that it's defined in capital cities for capital city purposes. What does that definition get wrong that matters practically, I think, for regional education and also for understanding the different types of students that are coming to seek a higher education?
Thanks. Good questions. Big questions. I think I guess this idea of the imaginary aspect of regional Australia is really my way of trying to just sort of flag the fact that the definitions are made. How we define regional Australia varies from different contexts, and there are clear definitions in certain kinds of legislation and so on. And I guess part of what I encourage people to think about is that, these are definitions that are perfectly useful and valid, but created for a purpose. They're an instrument, if you like, of, for we need to gather this data in this frame, or, report on this aspect of something. What in reality is then we have a whole lot of overlapping, intersecting definitions of what regional Australia is. And these are, not only geographic, but also, as you've mentioned, cultural, and there are ways we could look at this as well. So I think, I like to encourage that idea of the regional as something, that is intersectional, that's complex and variable in how we might look at it. And also, I think to just encourage, I think, as a society, that we we don't fall into that trap of, what you will understand, Robert, of a kind of false binary here, of the regional versus the urban, and which is just, it's so easy to fall into that. And I'm sure, I've been guilty of it myself in how I speak sometimes. But again, we just have to remember that this is a false binary, as one of my friends would say, well, all binaries are false, but that we need to interrogate this and question it, of like, this is not something that's real. The real world is more complex. So where am I going with that? I think it's really a kind of a plea for that recognition of the complexity and diversity of, if you were just speaking about Australia, but we could apply this to the wider world as well, of recognizing that, who we are as an Australian society doesn't fit into the neat boxes that we maybe use for many of the ways we frame public discourse, for example. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question.
No, I think it's a very illuminating one, because it starts to echo out from the institution. I think one of the challenges is that we often become very focused, as we obviously have been in this conversation, on the university, but it does beg questions around the broader community. If you have a community who has no interest in higher learning or thinking for the sake of thought, there's going to be very little interest in that community or in that society for higher learning institutions, which certainly ask what does precede them. And I do wonder if universities, because they do attract so much funding and because they are such political hotbeds, particularly with the volume of international students that you tend not to see in particularly local public schools, it's far more from the community. Do we sometimes perhaps let smaller or more local institutions off the hook a little bit and try and load too much onto the university and university system?
In terms of how that local community is functioning.
Yeah, in terms of how the local community is functioning, how it develops. I mean, particularly thinking about the arts. So many, my wife, who's currently a clinical psychologist, she used to be in the Australian Ballet, but so many of the dancers were drawn sort of from regional Australia. Yet you don't imagine, when you think of regional Australia, if I want to learn ballet, let's go to Dubbo. Probably doesn't immediately leap to mind. You'd probably more think, I should probably go to Sydney, or at least one of the big capital cities, and go to the Sydney Dance Company or sort of one of those institutions, as though that's the only place that dance is taught. But obviously it isn't. It's taught out the same with music, and I think that perhaps feeds into your work with sort of Arts Northwest, and I think some of the orchestras that you work with, that real grassroots development of the arts and the humanities, which then creates that, I think, feeder of fascination, of passion, of talent, that then echoes up to the universities proper.
Yeah, it's true. I think, again, this can be complex. I think that a large institution like a university in a smaller regional town or city, can bring wonderful things, and apart from anything else, just to the scale, as you mentioned, it's like there's many, they might be the largest employer in that region as well, just by virtue of the size and scale. How that interacts with, for example, cultural activities locally and things like that, I think is maybe mixed blessing a bit at times. I think there's situations where, for example, in the past at different times, I know of regional universities that have run fantastic sort of summer school programs, that are, not only for ag science, but also for painting and music and things. And these have been had really profound impact on whole industries, that where, I can actually think of towns in Australia where, there have been generations of, nationally recognized professional artists, and it's triggered by something like that happened, 30, 40 years ago. So the universities, these institutions can be a sort of amazing catalyst for communities. I think there's just the risk also that they can also sometimes stifle amazing work that might be anyway happening in the community. And I think It's interesting, as you were saying, with so many great Australian dancers and musicians have come from regional Australia, not just only recent times, but going way back into the 19th century. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Are they necessarily coming through schools and institutions? No, it's just that, not necessarily. It's just that because of this fluidity of the sort of, across that sort of the sandstone curtain, if you like, the urban regional divide, and people moving back and forth across it, there in every country town in Australia, there will be a few people who are amazing, like whether it's they're a nationally famous artist, or they're a great musician or composer, or, as you say, a dance teacher or something. These people are scattered right through the ecosystem of Australian towns, and even the smallest places. So I think that's something that we need to just be careful that that a larger institution with lots of funding and what have you doesn't stifle that, if you like, the natural cultural life of a place. Does that make sense?
Oh, it certainly does, and I think it's a particularly interesting observation, because there is always that, perhaps tension is the wrong word, but the notion that brilliance will always out. I mean, there's that argument. I sort of think of the Australian Chamber Orchestra and Richard Tognetti. I mean, arguably a talent of that caliber, irrespective of what's happening at a local level, irrespective of what the local high school does, it will just find a way to bubble to the surface, because there's that inner need to create that will just constantly find that outlet. And perhaps that does make, because we, again, coming back to brand and recognition, because we think of the individual brilliant performers, or the institutions that can name check a lot of individual brilliant performers, we become very focused on that element of it, and sometimes forget that they would emerge either way. However, we could still look at the local institutions and ask, what do they do, perhaps more for that middle rank of professional development.
It's true. And I think even for the most amazingly talented people, I think what often, and I can think of a few instances of this kind of situation where there's somebody we recognize as, a leader in an artistic field, for example. But similarly, we could look at academic examples. People who are great scholars who've come from, Brewarrina or somewhere originally, and who would think that's possible. But part of what I think, as you say, there's the risk in that the talent will out kind of idea, which, it appears to happen sometimes. I think, though, what it depends on is that somebody has to recognize it at some point and say to that young kid, or that student, actually, you can do this. Like, you could do something with this, and, you can stay here and work on the farm, but actually, you can play the flute amazingly well, and it, or whatever it is. I'm making stuff up, but it kind of, I don't know. I think even great talent will be trapped, or stifled, unless it kind of needs that someone has to create the thread, that gives people the idea that actually you can do something with this, and take it further.
And also, I think, to that point, and to expand on it, there has to be that outlet. There has to be a platform, in the sense of, I can play the flute, just to pick up on that analogy, wonderfully in my garage, but if I'm not able to get in front of a slightly larger audience, if I'm not able to get on the radio or some other medium to project from the local to the extended or to the international, then the talent is in a sense unheard of. And I think there is so much great talent that we do never hear of, because, again, I suppose the Matthew effect of, to those who have much, a lot is given. All of the airtime, to put it in dollar terms, the advertising revenue, or whatever it happens to be, tends to accrete to that 1 or 2%. And so a lot of that then, I think, becomes about how do we distribute, and not necessarily just money. I think there's certainly a great argument to be made, because access is as much about power as it is about anything else. Yes. How are we actually distributing that power to a broader base? This podcast is a wonderful example. I might not be able to convince the ABC or another broadcasting body to put my show on the air, but I have the power with the modern medium to simply have my show out there anyway. And then it's very much on me, my ability to market, people that are interested to surface it. It sort of provides those opportunities. So I'm just wondering, if there are any thoughts there around the funding, the access, the control of power, perhaps when it comes to talent being able to express and people giving talent that opportunity to shine.
Yes, I think part of what goes through my mind is, I think, as we've talked a little bit about already, that sense of, as important as our great institutions are, there is a lot of important work happens outside of that space. And actually, the media analogy with a big, corporation and what you can do as an independent is a really nice sort of example. And I think we could see that in many ways. And I think a question then for the university sector is for us to think about, we would hope that a university is able to foster talent and create the opportunities for people to build, the intellectual frameworks and knowledges that will more than get a job. My aspiration is I want to see, I want to see the people we are training through universities change the world, because somebody's got to fix it, It really is that kind of agenda, I think. And so are we actually, building and fostering this talent? And this relates back to what we were speaking about earlier, and the enormous scale of some of our educational institutions, or are we stifling it? Are we have we created an environment that actually kind of dampens down the ability to identify this person is somebody special who needs to do something important, or that group of people we need to foster because they're going to be able to do something special. I'm not sure if it comes back to what we were speaking about earlier. There's a risk we are losing the capacity to do that at an institutional level.
I think that's so true. I mean, I think it was probably Evelyn Waugh who noted that education has to do more than merely discipline the appetites. It's got to be about how does it create that notion of human flourishing. And I think that's perhaps where it does get challenging with institutions, because given particularly as they start to scale and start to get to a certain size, policy, regulation, process becomes inevitably important. I mean, we can't just get up in the morning and work out what we'll do for a class. We need a little bit more structure and discipline, but there is that challenging tipping point between when do we have enough regulation that is appropriate to be complied with, or when is compliance with regulation starting to substitute for quality. And I think that's perhaps a case I think you've made before, and that it may set practical minimum standards, but I suppose when looking at the regulatory settlement, do you see that as becoming an increasing burden in terms of stifling the creativity of both lecturers and students?
Perhaps yes, and it's sorry, now you can tell I'm already hedging my bets here, right? But look, yes, I think we all feel that burden of regulation in the education sector. The point about compliance and quality, I think, is useful to have in the background, because the compliance is the price of doing business. You just have to be compliant. Does that equate to quality? Well, of course not necessarily. It's just a baseline, and so I think that's one thing that we sometimes are at risk of forgetting. Probably not that I would say anybody working in universities forgets this themselves, but it becomes a capacity issue of if so much of our time and resourcing and energy goes into maintaining the compliance, how do we maintain the capacity for just a bigger, open-minded, longer-term vision and strategy that would be the quality piece, built on top of the compliance? I think there is a risk that we start to lose that ability. And this, it makes me think also of something. I'm interested in this in a systems theory kind of way as well, of how these large organizations, public organizations, particularly interesting, that as a society we've decided to establish and we invest huge amounts of money in. And I'm interested in that, for someone whose work I quite like and revisit periodically is Joseph Tainter, who's written on, systems theory and large organizations, social organizations, in that sense of, what's their lifespan and trajectory, and at what point do they cease to become useful for the society that built them or created them, or, or do they collapse, because of the way the organizations naturally evolve and kind of clog themselves up. And the key point I think that we see with universities that perhaps the kind of point of life cycle Australian universities or the Australian sector is at is a little bit of what people like Joseph Tainter have written about as an organization at a point of diminishing return, where we're trying to throw more and more at it and it's not working anymore. It's not delivering what we want. And so I think this is an aspect just at almost a national organization level that perhaps we need to think about.
I mean, at the risk of being overly agreeable, I think I'd agree, because there is that challenge that as you start to get those volumes, it then becomes about the simplification process. We almost want to see more variance. We create more variations. Eventually, we get to the point of there are so many subdegrees. What are these things even? Like, I don't understand what that degree even is. And then it becomes about, okay, well, what's a recognizable degree? Then let's go back to something that's much plainer. What it says on the tin is exactly what you get both as a student or as a potential employer. And I think that always creates a little bit of a pendulum effect. And I think as either as an institution,
Sure.
An academic, as a student, it just depends on where are we at with that pendulum, which we've seen, because there is always such a tight link between politics and between academia.
This is the pendulum, I think, is a really useful point, because we see this at the institutional level, but also at the national level of that swing from, I can remember, the first dean I worked for, many years ago, earlier in my career, used to talk about this of, the sector swings from, decentralized authority to centralized, and we can see that happening around us right now, but it also happens within an institution. It's a good point. I think, the power thing that you've touched on a couple of times, I think, is worth, touching on again, because I think there is this aspect of, especially when we're looking at public funding, of how does that link to politics, as you just said a moment ago, and the exercise of power, and in some ways, for government, the chief leverage, if you like, is either the funding or the withholding of funding from certain things. And I think it's interesting then to sort of map that a bit and see what's going on. There are curious things in the Australian higher education sector, which is that, for example, the 2025 data on public funding for Australian universities is it's 46.5% of the funding of universities is from government, so less than half, and that fluctuates a bit from year to year. Sometimes it's quite a bit less than that. And there are also different ways of measuring it that show it's substantially less, but that's kind of official numbers. So it's an interesting situation, I think, in terms of the government is actually not the majority shareholder in the sector, but acts as though it is. And in fact, more extreme than that is kind of in a phase of the pendulum swinging to the more extreme centralized regulation. So there is some interesting tension there, I think, again, for the broader society to think about of, well, what exactly is it that we want from this, and is it working? How best to deliver that?
In the longer term, though, that does create a very interesting tension, because, as you point out, government funding isn't the majority shareholder, to, I guess, use a shareholder analogy in this context. Yet if we were to start to look at more public funding for institutions, I suppose there's a bit of a case to be made that governments regulate because they fund. I mean, usually governments have very little interest in regulating things for which there's either no revenue or no outgoings. They tend to almost just leave it as a, to use the phrase, a bit of a law unto itself, which can then run the risk of, which I think we've seen in a number of sectors. Obviously, NDIS funding has been a good example recently, but I think we've also seen it in academic institutions where there can become some predatory practices which can damage students, damage institutions, and also just run up very large public bills for nothing like the type of value they're creating. So I think, how does, not that I'm necessarily asking for an answer, but I'm sort of interested in your musings on it. How do we, I suppose, keep the funding perhaps increasing, yet avoid some of the regulation that is almost inevitably going to become part of it? Do you think that comes down to institutional reputation? When private institutions garner enough reputation, we can then, much as we would trust a senior manager or a board member to disperse capital on behalf of an institution. I suppose, would we be looking for a similar type of model? We've, in a sense, solved it in the commercial world. Is it a similar solving in the educational world, where, yes, we can apply a lot of funding because we've developed a trust relationship with the institutions and the people that run them, but we can do that sans regulation?
Right. I think the difficulty at the moment for education is that the trust isn't there, right? We see that the government, for want of a better expression, is a bit dark on university governance at the moment, and we see that playing out, across the country in different ways, and with the ICAC hearings going on now and things like that. I think the government is doubtful about universities' capacity to govern themselves, and that's part of a broader doubt, I think, that we feel as a society, that's expressing itself. So, I think there's interesting. So, I have to wonder whether my musing on this would be that I'm not sure we have the right governance model, or it's a governance model that maybe no longer works. The wheels have fallen off a bit too much, and I think what we've had is a kind of a governance system, with university councils and so on, that a little bit have fallen into a pattern of perpetuating dysfunction, in that, people come and go from senior roles, or chancellors come and go, vice chancellors come and go, but the problem doesn't go away. So suggesting there's something systemic really is the problem, rather than people. Is a bit my feeling. I'm curious about, as you mentioned, in the corporate world, I'm curious whether there is actually something broader going on in a shift of governance requirements, maybe more generally outside of education. I'm just thinking about, I don't want to mention any particular companies, but we have also seen, media in the news not so long ago, major consulting firms, for example, having, shocking governance problems that are sort of being aired in public. These are consulting firms that give advice to universities, amongst other things, and so on governance. So I actually am, something I'm thinking about more recently is, is this a broader crisis of governance? I'd be interested to know what you think, Robert, with all the people you talk to. But that's just my musing on this, as I say.
Well, I guess at the risk of becoming the guest on my own show, I think there is a broader crisis of governance. I work predominantly in governance roles in organizations. When people hire me, or when I'm being interviewed, the first thing they'd like to look for is, what is the technical thing that I do? And they'd like something like project management, business analysis, what do you coordinate, what's the tangible? But it keeps coming back to, well, fundamentally, I'm a manager of people, and I'm a developer and manager of governance processes within institutions. But everywhere that I've worked, everywhere that I've studied, everyone that I've interviewed, there is always an endless tension between, and I'm slightly saddened at the way that it's always pitched, which is the tension between governance and outcome. And the idea that somehow governance is a wonderful enabler of outcomes, only to a certain point at which it becomes a brake on outcomes.
Yes.
And to an extent, I would acknowledge that model. I mean, the notion of red tape, particularly in government institutions, is just too ingrained in the public imagination, and it's too real for me to ever make the case. No. Governance at no point can be a brake on innovation. Can it actually gum up the system? And we particularly see that when looking in the entrepreneurial space. And you look at some countries like the US versus some other countries like Sweden and Norway, how many regulations and how much legislation do you have to get through just to start a business? Can I start a new business in, say, 12 to 24 days? Or actually, does it take me the better part of 6 to 9 months because of the amount of regulation, the checks, the applications I have to make, waiting for the application to come back, changing the application again, sending it off again, all at the end of the day to run the exact same business that I'd have run if there was less red tape to getting it there. But sadly, I think that while there is a lot of truth in governance being a bit of a blocker, it then creates a watering down or an excuse really to start to ignore governance. And I'm seeing that at the moment with a number of institutions that I've worked with, where they're developing business cases to spend the company money. And I think my default view is, if I'm spending somebody else's money, be it a handful of dollars or several tens of millions of dollars, I still am under an obligation to ensure that I'm spending that in the best possible way, rather than taking a little bit more of a, well, look, it's not my money. If it's not the greatest deal, it's all right. We'll fix it next quarter. I don't see that as acceptable. And for me, the governance mechanisms, particularly around a business case, are what very much drive that. And if I can't speak to what other options have I looked at, have I gone out to the market? Did I just take the first price and simply accept it and go, okay, well, that's what it costs? How have I pushed into that? And that, I think, then comes back to the overall reporting or management system within any institution, be it a business, be it an academic college. What is it that your boss is pressing you for, and what is the fundamental driver? And I think when time becomes the number one thing that people become fixated on, that's when governance starts to become more of I'll call it a bogeyman rather than a brake, because I think it's this idea that, look, yeah, we want some governance because somebody who cares more about the governance than about the time will ask us a question and we need to be able to answer it. But so long as I've got enough information to be able to answer that higher authority, I just want that to release me to effectively do whatever I want to do. I definitely see that as the key challenge, and that's a broader societal mindset that is very hard to resolve.
Actually, I think you've expressed that really nicely, and I agree that what we have at the moment seems to be governance structures that aren't working right in finding that fine balance between the necessary regulation and control and management, and the other side of what we need, which is knowing when to just let somebody get on with it and keep out of their way, because, and the thing I love most as a manager or a leader in my work is the times when I've done that and sort of got out of somebody's way to let them just run with something, and they do something that surprises me, that's not the outcome I imagined, but even better, so I think that's, as you say, we can be in a governance way, we can be a brake on that kind of natural innovation and creativity if we're not careful, and that's a bit happening too much.
Oh, it certainly does become a stifler. I mean, in my own direct experience, I remember during my PhD, my supervisor was very much, let Robert just get on with it. The faculty that were reviewing it, looking at the stage gates, determining whether I would continue into my second year and progress with the degree, was very much more, no, there's a process, almost stop thinking, lie back and just let the process happen.
Right.
Well, hang on a second. I thought at this point of my academic career, we'd finally be at the level of, no, actually, you've got to do the driving here. This is about your independent thought, your independent work. Yes, absolutely, we should be supportive, but fundamentally, if you can't get this thing across the line, that's really got to be on you, because you're asking for a degree that almost tells the world you can do independent research. And yet we're insisting that you work within a process that's almost denying you that independence.
That's a great example, Robert, because I was thinking just earlier when we were talking about regulation and red tape that I was thinking in the education context, so much of the regulation we have is because terrible things have happened. And, terrible things have happened to students over the years in university, for example. So now we have lots more regulation around that, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Terrible things happen in the workplace, between staff, that we have more regulation to try and prevent now or to manage risks. So I think that's one aspect of the university. If we feel like the temptation to complain about too much red tape, it's like, well, that's come about for a reason. It's because we did bad things, and this
So
is
true.
to prevent. And so that's one aspect. And I think the PhD is a really nice example because it's exactly this. It's that in the old days, where, and I'm never, of course, saying that the old days were perfect, but, there was that time when the PhD was a bit of like somebody is left alone with an office to figure out, something that they might write into a thesis, sometimes with, minimal contact with supervisors, etc. at all. And something may or may not come of it. And I think then the concern is where the kind of increasingly tight management of PhD candidates has come about is because so many of under the old system, so many PhDs went off the rails and either couldn't be completed or people, in despair gave up and or just didn't have the support that they needed when they needed it. And so that's, what I mean? So the sort of constraints you felt have come about as to try and create that safety net, if you know what I mean, but at risk of losing the intellectual freedom, as you say.
And I certainly understand it. I guess misfortunate. I considered it slightly misfortunate. When I finished my my MBA, before going into my PhD, the university, because of the challenges with the wheels falling off so many candidates' research, they inserted effectively another degree, which meant you might have got honours, you might have scored whatever entrance marks are necessary for a PhD program, but before you can do that, you need to complete this mandatory 2-year Masters of Research. And I was fortunate that they allowed me to skip the first year because I'd done so much research work before. But when I joined the second year cohort, I was staggered sitting in a room of people who had actually never been to the university's library. And but hang on a second, you've got an undergraduate degree? They were like, yes. I said, you've also got another master's? They said, yes. And I said, how have you done that with never walking into the library or even going onto the library website and getting some journal articles? Because for them, the lecturer provides the course materials. They learn the course materials, they answer questions based on the course materials they've been given. This idea of independent inquiry was not something that had effectively surfaced in any of effectively the 4 or 5 years, I think for many of them, education they'd had up to that point. And I sort of then wonder, is the solution yet another degree? Let's create a research degree and even tighter frameworks around the PhD program. Or is it, let's actually look at some of the undergraduate degrees? No, we acknowledge most people won't go on to something like a PhD, but if they wanted to, do we at least have some of the key touch points that help to develop that notion of independent inquiry? And I think even if a person doesn't want to go on past their bachelor, the idea that a person would leave any form of a degree course without that notion of independent work, independent thinking, and the ability to write in, I suppose I would term it for a lot of people kind of quote unquote long form. I can write 2,000 or 3,000 words and not become stressed out of my mind, who can write that much. Because when you get into corporate life, again, that's so often the challenge that I find when I face a lot of executives. I'll write an extensive business case for something running over multiple pages because the company wants to spend several $1 million. The executive is, look, Robert, please, 4 bullet points or fewer. That's all I want. And I'm like, is that enough to make this decision? I know if I were the deciding body, it wouldn't be. I'd be, there's not enough information here.
Yeah, this is how mistakes can get made, isn't it? With yeah. I think I agree with you. I think that whole, I mean, it's one of those overused words in education of scaffolding. Of that how do we support, scaffold the students' learning towards, as you say, perhaps that ultimate ideal of a PhD. Yeah, it's again one of those things that we often don't get right, isn't it? I think it relates back to what we were talking about earlier today of the again the problem of scale and the sort of the industrial delivery of education. I mean, I see in my lifetime a shift from a I recall as an undergraduate a very strong sense, that was probably made explicit. Probably people actually said this to us that research training was beginning from first year. It's like that
Yeah.
every essay was part of this pathway of research training. I feel that was quite explicit in the last century when I did my undergraduate study, where I know there are many universities now where people would say research training happens at postgrad level. So it relates again to what we were saying earlier of that sort of vocationalization of the undergrad learning, and we've lost something a little bit valuable there, I think.
And I think that also allows that brief touch on the humanities. I mean, certainly in my lifetime over the last 30, 40 years, there's always been this very strong push towards the sciences. That notion that don't worry about being able to make an argument. That's not what it's about. It's about how do you develop code? How do you follow the scientific practice? And I'd never agreed with it. I'd always been very uncomfortable with this notion that anybody, no matter the work that you're doing, should still have a degree of philosophical underpinning, because it starts to speak to the reason of why I'm choosing to do what I do. And even if you go into something like engineering, there still need to be certain choices that you make. And a lot of them can be based on data, but there's also a degree of the being able to form the wider case. And when I look at the research done by some of the really great thinkers, I mean, probably the most publicly accessible or publicly known formula is probably Einstein's E equals mc squared. But of course, his theory of general relativity is it's a book. It's a written argument. It's not just mathematical equations that go to lead into it. And that's where I do see, as institutions have sort of pushed into that, it's very interesting to see AI now, that in the workplace, suddenly your ability to do data analysis, to do engineering, to do code development is no longer the most important thing, because the AI does so much of that heavy lifting. So I just want to continue on, given the prevalence of AI in so many conversations around education, around job readiness, around life in the workplace. And with AI doing so much of the data heavy lifting, the catchphrase of the day very much seems to be human in the loop. But that obviously does beg the question, what is it to be human? What is it that we are doing in that loop that creates the true value, both for humanity more broadly, but also within a work context, what it means for our organization? And so I'm very interested to hear your thinking around what role the humanities can play in developing our capacities to be the best possible version of human.
Wow, and what a great question. What does it mean to be human? This is perhaps an age-old question, isn't it? And one I don't necessarily have an easy answer for. But I think, one of the things that's very exciting about our present time, and that's being, in a way, AI technologies are a catalyst here, is this question has become pressing for us as a society, isn't it? Or for humanity at large, is, well, who are we really in relation to this technology, and how might we interact with it? What might we think about in terms of how our cognition works, and what we think of as our intelligence? I think these are such great questions, and as I say, it's an exciting time. In a way, some of this is being brought into sharper focus, as we face the technology we're increasingly living and working with. I think, I know I'm not the first person to say this, you'll have heard this before, but I think there is something I have some sympathy for, is the view that, what we're facing is not necessarily a technological problem, but a social and community one. And I think there's some useful truth in that, as we think about, I think we do have to rethink, who are we really? What is our purpose in this universe, if there is one, and what's our future? What might our futures look like, as an exercise of imagination? The I think for me, where this relates back into sort of if you like, the bigger project of universities, for example, is around that um, the the questions around, what's going wrong for us, and what's not right in the world. And, a fair bit of this is actually on us. We've, as a species, we've messed up a whole lot of things, from the global climate down, to local things. And so I think, there is that sense of, how do we move forward from this? Can we solve these problems? How would we do that? And then I guess in that equation, does AI help us with, do these kinds of technologies help us with this? How or not, and how might that work? So, I think there are, I guess, around when we think of this in a disciplinary expertise way, there is the tech side of this and the scientific side, the programming and neurological and linguistic thinking that powers this kind of AI technology. But it's something actually we should probably all talk about more. Actually, I've just thought, just on that point, is that these technologies are built on, what we might think of as computational linguistics. And so I think, again, connecting back to some of our academic discipline areas, that we sometimes lose sight of that. The 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 issue then of, how we move forward with this, I think, is the challenge. And as I say, I think that is a human question rather than a technological one. Sorry if that's circling around the question a bit.
And then maybe if we might turn a little bit to your own institution, because you're now with the Nantian Institute, and I'm very interested to sort of hear a little bit more about the institute, particularly for some listeners that may not be as familiar with it, and the approach that you're taking there, because obviously a lot of the challenges that you've seen that shall we say beset very, very large institutions. Being a slightly smaller institute, I'm wondering, does that make you a little bit more nimble? Does it, as academics, empower you that little bit more to be able to put in some of the changes that are often discussed and people would like to do, but the sheer institutional inertia at very, very large universities, in a sense, prevents the staff, shall we say, from doing that? How do you find the model you've got there at the Institute working that bit better for the students?
Oh, a really good question. I think, I think for a smaller, perhaps private education providers, there is, as you say, that aspect of certain kinds of agility that are difficult to deploy in a much larger or older institution. The institutions, as you know, kind of pluck themselves up, in administrative ways over time. So I think, I think it's part of what has attracted me to Nantian Institute is a little bit that sense of, here's something smaller at a relatively early stage of its organizational development and trajectory, and could we try something different here? I think, many of us across the private higher education sector are thinking in this kind of way. I think it's so one of the things I would say is, not necessarily that public or private is better. I certainly wouldn't be arguing that, but the difference is valuable. And just as, disciplinary diversity is valuable, I think we need these different kinds of models. It links back to those kind of questions of, what would a university of the future look like? A successful university or a higher education institute in Australia. There's a deeper question behind that for me of, what would a real Australian university look like? Rather than the transplanted colonial model, as you and I have talked about earlier. And I guess, for Nantian Institute, it's just one of many other possibilities that I think we should be taking seriously and thinking about and exploring. Nantian, it's interesting. It has a Chinese name. It means, the southern sky, or Tian actually implies heaven. So this is quite nice for me. In my thinking, it kind of connects to. In my own mind, some First Nation sensibilities as well. And I think when I think of the name Nantian Institute, what often springs to mind is Tyson Yunkaporta writing in one of his books about the ancestors sitting around the campfire in the sky looking down at us. And so I sort of feel some philosophical affinity there between these two different cultures. But look, I think for what attracted me to Nantien was, I think the important thing actually is alongside the aspects of what we've talked about, of it provides possibilities for doing things different. Underpinning that is a sense of values, and for me, it's not, regardless of whether one is Buddhist or not. This is an institution that's founded on Buddhist values. That's the key thing. Some of the monastics I work with, Buddhist monastics, actually are the strongest proponents of the idea that higher education is by definition secular, and I quite appreciate that. In that it's scholarly, it's critical. It's not about trying to convert people to religion. It's a bigger agenda about what kind of positive impact can we have on society. So the values, I suppose, of wisdom, compassion, and the application of learning in the wider world, things that I can get behind, so that's a bit the level at which I initially was attracted to Nantien, alongside that I think this important aspect of seeing this is a kind of institution, a type of institution where we can do things differently. Part of it, I think, even just as a practical example is, we might think of how these values of, say, wisdom and compassion might play out in our teaching. We can picture that, I think, fairly easily. Or, how it might play out in our interactions with students or with external stakeholders and so on in informing how we work. But then I think there are also questions around, well, how would that play out in terms of governance? What would that look like? And again, I think this is where we have an interesting experiment to work through of, can we apply this to other areas of work where it's sometimes easy in either the progression of day-to-day business, or the pressure of a sense of the need for compliance, in a highly regulated sector, that we become preoccupied with those kind of mechanical things and sometimes forget the values that brought us together as a scholarly community.
I find that very interesting because I think in this life, are often very quick to label Christian, Buddhist, secular, religious, and naturally labels are important. We need to understand things, and the nature of understanding is to start to apply language to them, and therefore by extension labels. But often in that discussion, what tends to get lost is the notion of the universals. And I think what is so interesting is when you look at, in this particular case, religious beliefs that have developed in many ways worlds apart, they're still tapping into what we could certainly term universal values, such as wisdom and compassion. I mean, compassion is something that's writ as large, I would argue, in Buddhism as it is in Christianity.
Absolutely.
As it is in Judaism. Cultures that in many ways are very diverse, but yet still come together around this universal core. And perhaps that is something to be said in that discussion around what is it to be a truly Australian university, and this notion of a diverse society. And we're certainly seeing those conversations arising now, this idea that we must be a monoculture, yet arguably no, we are such a diverse culture, yet we still have a not a single, but like a central core of wisdom, of compassion, of shared beliefs, and that's what brings us together, that's what unites us. And do you think in that sense, being I guess initially a Buddhist institution, yet having practicing scholars who are so committed to the secular, and students attending, many of whom are not Buddhist, yet you still get that wonderful community of thought around these central values?
That's a nice phrase, community of thought, isn't it? Yeah. And yeah, look, I think you're right. It does, these values do tap into something one would like to think of as universal. And I don't know, I look around, when I read the news in the morning, I'm not so convinced that humans as a species are fundamentally compassionate, but I like the idea that it's something, I like the idea though that it's something we should practice, and again, I think, as you mentioned earlier, the application of, if you like, scholarly reflection to, then how do we put this into practice? I think the application of the learning, this is the key part, right? Where the exciting things happen. And I suppose it's also, as you say, these ideas tap into some kinds of universal values and the deep history of humanity. But the application, as we were talking earlier with AI, how we apply these things in the world is changing moment by moment, generation by generation, and perhaps I think that's one of the great values of what we think of as higher learning and research and scholarship is the figuring out how do we live with these values in the world as it is now, or as the world we are moving towards. How would our students be able to apply these in the future when I'm gone? What will they carry forward? I was interested.
It is
just
certainly very.
Oh, sorry, Robert. I was just picking up something you mentioned a moment ago about this kind of move towards the monoculture in some of our public discourse recently, and I think this is something I just wanted to pick up on because it's really, I think, important at the present time in Australia. And again, it comes back to a lot of what you and I have been talking about of the diversity of governance models, diversities of ways of thinking, and I think this is what a discipline is in an academic sense. Is it's a way of thinking. It's a knowledge system like a language is. A great friend of mine who's a linguistics professor, always says, well, a language is not it's not just a way of communicating, it's a way of thinking. And his argument, which I feel a strong affinity with, is that if we lose a language, it stops being spoken, or we lose that. It's a technology of thinking that's gone with the language, not just a way of communicating. And I think it's a really nice example of just the importance as we try and solve the difficult problems that we face as a human species and the world today, that we can't afford to lose knowledge systems. I think we need to be holding on to that diversity. The language is a really good example with this idea of that whether it's the terrible old idea of a white Australia, or the idea that everybody should speak English, because that's my language. I think we just need to be really conscious that this is something really dangerous, because we are. Firstly, it's a power play, but in that if I want to force the people to speak my language rather than I learn theirs, but it's also just a narrowing of the scope of our capacities to solve the problems we face.
I do certainly love your quote there about language being a way of thinking, and it does certainly remind me a little bit. I think it was that quote by Wittgenstein, perhaps, who said, "The limits of our language is the limits of our world," and
Absolutely.
that I think was a theme that was very much unpacked by Steven Pinker in The Language Instinct, in the sense of how is it that we don't just use words to achieve an action, but we can actually convey a very complex idea. I can describe a beautiful recipe to you about, I don't know, a lovely risotto, and you can almost taste the meal if my language is descriptive enough. So I certainly really love that notion of language being very much about a way of thinking, and also a capacity to think. And by expanding that language, and that's why I'm always so love it to hear. To work with other people who come from different language backgrounds, because so often in their cultures, they'll have words for things that in English, I simply don't have words for it. And now I've got to actually stretch and adapt my capacity to see the world based on how they understand things. I think that's such a beautiful, beautiful concept.
It is beautiful and wonderful. And I think we underestimate the power of this, perhaps. But maybe it's the powerfulness of, as you say, that expansion of the mind and the expansion of the mental technology, if you like, through learning and language, for using this example as we are of languages. Maybe the fact that it's powerful is what some people fear. I don't know, but there is something interesting there that but I hope that it's a current topic, as in Australian politics at the moment, and I do hope we can move beyond a sense of fear and embrace this diversity of ways of thinking as we move forward. I think it relates also to this, for just the way I think, this idea of language or ways of thinking as a kind of technology relates to that idea I have of the university is a problem-solving machine. Again, it's it's a sort of a human organization, an organization made up of people, but it's a kind of technology that we've developed over centuries for a purpose. And the question is, is it fit for purpose now, or do we need to make some adaptation for the future?
Certainly, I think you're very much onto a point there that so much of it is fear-driven, to some extent, fear of the unknown, perhaps for others, fear of what they can't control. There's that notion of, but if I can't control something, maybe it will take something away from me that I value greatly. And it is such a shame, I think, when individuals or even worse, when societies descend into fear-based language and fear-based thinking, because it is just so reductionist, which is highly problematic. To sort of segue almost off that control idea, but I trust very much not a fear idea. I think it was Kassan Haj who had the line that vice chancellors have come to behave like the heads of collaborationist governments. I'm sort of interested in your take as a leader now of an institution. Do you feel that sense that you're sort of the head of a collaborationist government, or has being in the seat taught you perhaps a different lesson?
I think there's some truth to what he says, and I rather like the idea. I think I do feel this in my work a little bit. I can have that sense of what he's talking about. We are. We work in higher education within such a tightly regulated environment, and increasingly, as you and I have spoken about, increasingly, if you like, the pendulum swinging towards increased, more tight regulation. And so I think for the leaders of universities or small institutions like my own, we are a bit caught between that sense of delivering what the government wants, which is legislated and so on, and what the other stakeholders behind our respective institutions are wanting to see delivered, and at the same time, I think trying to match this up with, well, what is this? What is it that the community around us wants? Is that the same thing as what the does it align with the if you like, the pressure coming from above, from government or investors, etc., in different institutions or university councils? Is it aligned with that sense of what the broader community is seeking from us? Perhaps not always. And I think the other interesting, I don't know, it's not necessarily. Maybe it is a tension. I'm not sure if it necessarily has to be, but there's an interesting interface there also between, the if you like, the aspirations of staff and students within the institution. And so I feel in my own work, I feel in the middle of all that, and sometimes it's coming back to I suppose our conversation about language. Sometimes my role is a bit like a translator of sort of, translating across these kind of boundaries of, what these people mean. How do I translate this to that group of people, or and so on. And how we the big challenge, I think, is, how we align these things. What is, and I feel that, I think as a sector, I think where we have some problems is about that misalignment of perhaps the function of a university and this, I think this requires us to look deeply into what the drivers of that are. What is it that drives, for example, the government to legislate in a certain way at this particular point in time, and how does that connect to other things, for example?
Interest.
Sorry, I was just thinking the aspiration, I think, is something that relates even to something as, in other ways, kind of practical as the job ready graduates idea, in terms of there are these kind of government level aspirations for what they, what people in Canberra see, university graduates should look like, to what extent that matches in any way what a school leaver going to university next year aspires to is not clear. And in fact, we can see in the way that the job ready graduates policy thinking has not delivered entirely what it was meant to deliver. So we can see actually there is increasingly data showing, that actually there is a bit of a mismatch between what students are wanting to do, what students aspire to, and what the government would like to squeeze them into. So I think these are it's a sort of a simple example, but of the quite complex pressures, I think, coming from various sides.
I certainly think it's a very interesting pressure and also challenge. I remember, I think when I was in prep school, one of the luminaries came and gave a talk to our year, and his thinking from industry was very much, boys, by the time you graduate, the jobs you will be doing don't actually exist today. And that does create that inevitable challenge of how do you plan, or, in a governmental sense, how do you legislate for a future which is by definition quite unknown? We can make certain educated assumptions, but, as we've seen in the last handful of years, children that are encouraged to learn a foreign language in Australian schools, that language sort of shifts about every 15 to 20 years as to what the future looks like. Does the future look like a Mandarin future? Does the future look like a Spanish-speaking future? Does the future look like a Nepalese-speaking future? And I think that is that interesting challenge. And you sort of think of how much AI has changed things in the last 5 years, at the risk of coming, back to the topic that's, so prevalent. It's a bit like talking about the weather. But expectations of, I think, graduates, say in 2015, was particularly in the sciences very much about needing to understand the principles, the models, the engineering, the code. Now, because so much of that lifting is now done by the models themselves, the input of the engineer doing the work has in many respects changed. And I think that probably is that interesting question when one does lead either an institution, a society, or a government, trying to predict, or perhaps the better term is guess, for that future is particularly challenging. But I'm also wondering if it becomes a bit of an issue of scale. Thinking about you and I in this conversation, we are a dyad. There are two of us talking. For us to get together and think about what we would like to do next is obviously of a much smaller magnitude than it is if we're working across populations of thousands or millions. And just turning again back to sort of the work you're doing at Nantien, is some of the benefit that it has a result of it being a smaller private institution? And I'm wondering, does some of that work then break down or not scale? I'm just blue skying as to some of the things that perhaps undermine the very large institutions or government planning once you start to work something at the scale. And I think it almost returns to our conversation a bit earlier about curiosity, about compassion, and sometimes it seems as individual humans, we're very compassionate towards each other, but as a society, we're quite cold, a little bit uncaring, and a little bit, what's in it for me? And I'm interested in what is the tipping point of that. Perhaps it is a scale one, and how have you seen that play out in an academic institutional setting?
Oh, great questions. Yeah, I think it does link back to, what we were talking about earlier of that fundamental question of what does it mean to be human. And for me, in this question, the fraught question of, the impact of AI in higher education, where there's been, so much kind of stress and even panic about it in the last couple of years. For me, I keep coming back to this idea that, well, but, I work in this business of education because I'm interested in people. And it's not that I'm uninterested in technology, but what I'm primarily interested in is people and that human aspect, And so I think, as you say, the scale then maybe is important in that I think sometimes when we think of the higher education sector, or as you say, a large, one of our great universities, these enormous institutions, perhaps the bit that doesn't scale is that sense of the human and the conversation like you and I are having, as you said a moment ago. That I think we forget that this is the real work. The real work maybe doesn't actually start from something at a national level or whatever, but it's you and I talking. It's the other people that we will talk to during the day, how we interact with them, what kinds of thinking is shared, and I do think from a fundamental education level, this is how we change the world. It's and I guess we can't underestimate how. I guess an interesting little example. What just popped into my mind is a student that I taught many years ago, many decades ago, with a group of other students from that time. A while ago we caught up for dinner and talking around the table. One of these people who, as I say, had been in a first year lecture I gave many years ago, actually said, one of the things that's really shaped the way I work now, Alistair, is when you said, and he quoted me from, a 25 years ago or more lecture, and I thought, my goodness, that this thing I said that I don't even remember has resonated, for all these years in somebody's mind is kind of daunting in a way, but I think it's just an example. I think of that ripple effect, of how things pass out into the world. We don't know the outcome, we can't see, but what we can see is the conversation we have now, or the work we do with a class now, or the research we are doing now. That's that we can see, and we can do that well. And if we do that well, there will be a good outcome in the end. But that's sometimes beyond us. I guess an example for an Antian Institute, but I think would apply in many other ways, is that for example. One of the interesting things about Nantian Institute is we at this time only offer postgrad courses. So our student cohort, it's professional people who, in many cases, already have a career and are looking for rounding that out or developing their thinking in certain ways, and so there's a particular cohort of our students who, for example, work in various levels of government, government and public service. And so, for me, I think, this is something very interesting that one would hope over time we can see, well, maybe the kinds of thinking that can be developed through the study and research they are doing with us now. I would like to hope that, 10, 20 years' time, this might play out in the form of social policy or, public policy more generally. So, but that's an outcome in a way beyond my individual control, but we can do the small scale work that will lead to that. We can do that today.
I think that's such a beautiful image to finish on, that notion of the ripples, because as you sort of rightly point out, potentially that work is beyond your direct control, but arguably it's not beyond the ripples that your teaching and your thinking create. The way in which that student 25 years ago rises to a great office, perhaps becomes Prime Minister one day, and remembers what their undergraduate lecturer might have said to them, even what their high school teacher said to them, and the impression that created, and their desire to, I almost hate to use the phrase because I feel it cheapens it a bit, but to do good in the world. How can I think about my fellow humans beyond just my personal self-interest? And so much of that does drive from the teachers that we'll never hear of, that are in institutions day in, day out, and their work sadly is seen as inconsequential because they don't have billions of dollars of resources at their fingertips. But to an extent they do, because they have the most critical resources at their fingertips, which is our humanity, the people that they touch and the lessons that they teach. So I think that's such an amazing image to close out on. We might finish up with a lightning round, some certainly quick fire questions, and I very much leave it up to you as to if you want a quick fire answer or something a little more in depth.
Okay.
First would be, what do you think is the most overrated word in higher education?
Well, it's kind of a hyphenated word. I would say student-centered. Of course, it's a lovely concept. but I think it gets overused and misused, and it sometimes can be used as a bit of a smokescreen. Of course, my teaching is student-centered, and but when I don't know, sometimes I think we, if you like, protest a bit too much. It's like it's the more, sometimes in discussions in our sector when this is played on a bit too much, I start to think, well, but are you really like are we really student-centered in what we do? I'm not convinced. So that's one.
I think that's an excellent one. I was, at the risk of digressing in a lightning round, I was interviewing a management consultant the other day, and I said, "What's the one word you worry about when you see it in a business strategy?" And he said, "Customer centric." He said, fundamentally, if the customers are not at the heart of what you do, the idea that you have to write customer centric as a strategy pillar, he said, it fills me with dread. Because he said often the company does that to get away with actually having to be customer centric but we said it in our press release. I do wonder if there's that same thing about the sort of student centricity in that same construct.
It's, I think, exactly the same. Yeah.
What's one book you would make every vice chancellor read and hopefully learn from?
Look, what springs to mind here would be I don't know, maybe I won't say an exact title, but what I'm reading actually myself recently is a small book of poems by an Australian poet, just not long ago published, and it's a book of poems that kind of as you read through them, they start to add up to a bigger picture. It's actually like a novel, written in a series of poems. And as I say, it's an Australian author writing also from a migrant experience and talking about, in a way, about aspects of life in Australia, but also that's sort of a long history of family history that goes beyond when they had come to Australia, as is the case for so many of us here. I suggest this just because I don't know. I think vice chancellors, let's assume are good-hearted people really trying to do their best, and I'm sure that probably like you and I, they've read more than their share of management books and strategic planning books and all the Harvard Business Review articles and all of that. And I just think, oh, maybe you don't need more of that. Take half an hour with a cup of tea and read an Australian poem. I think that would be worthwhile. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to continue with that theme and really then ask, I guess, the next follow-up question, given your field, a piece of music that's taught you more about leadership than any leadership book.
Oh. Actually, lots of music goes through my mind, but I think okay, well, I think one I think that has had some lasting value for me in my thinking is a little piece by the composer. I think we mentioned earlier Morton Feldman. I wrote my PhD about him, and he wrote this very small piano piece called Intermission 6, and it's just a little series of individual notes and a couple of chords that are in the original sheet music are just scattered, looking a bit randomly on the page, and and they don't seem to connect, in any particular way, but and you can play them in any particular order, and you can presumably, he doesn't specify if you have to play them only once or multiple times, and so performances of this piece will sometimes be very short, but if you repeat through them in different orders, then it can continue for quite a long time. And so it seems like something, seems like something very unstructured, and this could turn out very differently every time you play it or every time you hear it, and yet I guess because it's a piece I'd worked on and listened to lots of recordings, analyzing different ways people played it and so on, it gets to a point where, I only need to hear one of those notes and I straight away know that piece. Oh, that's intermission 6. And and it's also that whichever order you play these through, actually there is a hidden structure. This is a series of notes that are not random. They are carefully chosen. And there is so on the surface it looks like this is going to play out a bit randomly every time somebody plays it, but actually there is a deeper structure, and no matter what you do, that deeper structure is always going to manifest. And so I guess for me, this is something I think about in that sense of freedom and control, and how you set a structure or you set some rules, but and then what might play out. How will that what will the effect of that be, or what is the result of this particular frame or this particular set of rules? And I think the lesson for me is around that sense of something that looks very free at the beginning turns out not to be, is a useful thing to look at in, if you like, the structures of an organization or in day-to-day management as well.
That really is one of the most fabulous things I've heard about leadership. Almost this sense that we become leaders. Sometimes if we're senior leaders, we get this notion of we have power, we can control, we can decide. Yet there is this inner working, this inner framework, which we're always working within. I think that's incredibly beautiful. And finally, please finish this.
Robert, I was just thinking there is a little add-on to that I think is useful. I've found useful as well, which is then. There is a little field in sort of the performing arts, a field of study called performance studies. And there's some interesting research done there that I think applies to music, but it originally grew out of people studying theatre. But there is an idea that can be demonstrated in quite a lot of contexts, which is that if you put people into an environment where there seem to be no rules or very few rules, and you say, do whatever you like, the outcome will tend to be quite constrained, and if you like, we might say conservative. It's like if you take away all the rules, then people fall back on where they feel safe, and so I think this is also for me another aspect of how we might think about organizational structures and things like that, is that I think some rules and boundaries are useful because they actually push us to be more creative, or even if it's like it's a little bit of a box that we are actually uncomfortable about, and we are pushing against the boundaries. That's also useful, But if you say to people, just do whatever you like, then actually often what happens won't be very useful or interesting.
I think that's a wonderful observation. I mean, we're often being exhorted to think outside the box, but by definition, we have to be in a box before we can think outside of it.
Yes, exactly. You start with the box, and then you can break it. Yeah, yeah.
And finally, please finish the sentence. A university is for
saving the world.
I love it. Alistair Noble, on the subject of leadership, good night and good luck.
Thank you, Robert.